again, this is the panel on integrating land use and transportation policy in California. I'm Richard Frank, and I have the privilege and pleasure of moderating this panel. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to talk about one of the oldest, most long-standing issues in California environmental policy, and simultaneously one of the most urgent. The idea of integrating or attempting to integrate what until now has been a largely segregated set of policies, California transportation policy and California land use and housing policy, is very important. And the theme of this conference has been California's leadership role in so many areas of environmental law and environmental policy. And in the interest of full disclosure, I would have to say, at least it is my opinion, that when we're talking about land use and transportation policy, this is an area where California is a bit of a laggard. Not only are we not a national and international leader, I think in many ways we are at the other end of the spectrum. And indeed, I was at a conference earlier this week where Mary Nichols, the chair of the California Air Resources Board, said that in her travels around the nation and around the world, the one criticism she rather consistently hears about California is the idea of urban and suburban sprawl, and how California, unlike many other parts of the nation and the globe, really has really replicated a number of land use and transportation mistakes, or perhaps missed opportunities. Well, that may be changing. Three things are new that suggest there may be some promise for, at a minimum, renewed debate over these issues and focus on these issues, and hopefully some solutions. Among those three developments, which are interrelated, in November of 2006, the Infrastructure Bond Act were all adopted. We'll be hearing more about that, but bottom line, focusing on infrastructure, transportation, and housing, and some other subjects. Vast new infusion of public funds in the aggregate amount of some $43 billion to address the problem. Renewed legislative interest in the larger issue of integrating land use and transportation policy, and we'll be talking about some of the legislation that is in play on those issues. Third, finally, and as you heard both this morning from our plenary speaker, Dr. Chu, and in the panel that preceded ours, the issue of climate change has further sharpened and exacerbated the need to address these issues. We talked about AB32 and the accompanying 2005 gubernatorial executive order, which requires a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 to 1990 levels, a reduction of about 20%, and by the year 2050, reduction of 80% in greenhouse gas emission levels compared to 1990 levels. As you heard both yesterday and today from Professor Carlson, California has some success stories with respect to energy consumption. Since the early 1970s, on a per capita basis, or actually on an aggregate basis, California's energy consumption has remained largely flat as compared to the nation. But there are also some disproportionate impacts here in California. As again you've heard from our previous speakers, a disproportionately large amount of our energy budget is consumed by the transportation sector. It's approximately 40% here in California, which is a significantly higher number than the national average, and a concomitant amount of our California greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to the transportation sector, about 38 to 40%. Again, referring to no less an authority than Mary Nichols, the chair of the Air Resources Board, the ambitious AB32 targets, about which you've heard a great deal, can't be met with existing technologies. Tony Brunello talked about that 101 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions that have got to be reduced to get to the 2020 targets. And all that is exacerbated, that challenge is exacerbated by population growth and its related impacts. A couple of statistics. California's population is growing at the rate of 2% per year. We currently have 37 million people in the People's Republic of California. That's expected to increase by some 9 million additional residents by the year 2030. That in turn translates into a need for about 3.25 million new housing units within the same period, a need for additional housing units. You also have been introduced through earlier panels to the concept of VMTs, or vehicle miles traveled. The aggregate vehicle miles traveled in California is growing at a greater rate than the population growth. VMTs are growing at approximately 3% annually. So we're not going to be able to meet those ambitious AB32 goals either in 2020 or 2050 until and unless we address the issues of population growth, land use planning, transportation reform, and the integration of those principles in a way that really hasn't been done effectively previously. So the purpose of this panel, the theme of this panel is what's the current state of play, what's the prognosis with respect to this very ambitious and indeed critically necessary integration of land use and transportation in California, made all the more critical and pressing as a result of the challenges we're all facing with respect to climate change. And to address those issues, we have a stellar panel. Let me introduce them all now before we go into the individual presentations. At my far right is Assemblymember Dave Jones, who represents with distinction the 9th Assembly District in the Sacramento area. He chairs the Assembly Judiciary Committee and serves on a number of other committees. Before his election to the State Assembly, he served as a member of the Sacramento City Council for 6.5 years, so he's intimately familiar with the challenges of transportation and land use policy from the local governmental level. He is a lawyer. He got his law degree from the Harvard Law School and also got a degree from the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. To Dave's immediate left and to my right, Bill Fulton is president of the Solimar Research Group based in Ventura. That's a land use policy firm. He's publisher of one of the most well-respected publications on land use and planning, the California Planning and Development Report. He's written books on the subject. He is one of the most prominent thinkers in the area of land use policy in California and the American West that I know. He also teaches at USC for the University of California and is, I'm sorry?
University of Southern California.
Yes, University of Southern California and the University...
Oh, UC Davis.
UC Davis as well.
UC Davis Extension.
I know because I've guest lectured for you, so you can't get away from that. And a delicious irony, having focused as an academic and teacher and a deep thinker on land use policy for many years. More recently, he has entered the political fray, and he now serves as deputy mayor of the city of Ventura. So he is both a land use expert and a land use policymaker. Third, finally, we have Kassie Siegel to my immediate right. Kassie is director of the Climate, Air, and Energy Program at the Center for Biological Diversity, which is a nonprofit organization which combines conservation biology with litigation, policy advocacy, and the like. And I must say that you heard yesterday when we were talking about AB32 litigation that the California Attorney General has played a very prominent role with respect to climate change litigation. I think it's fair to say that with respect to the NGO sector, there has been no organization that has been more prominent and more successful than the Center for Biological Diversity, and that's due in large part to Kassie's intellect and energies. And I'm delighted to mention that Kassie is a graduate of the UC Berkeley School of Law, so we're delighted to have her back with us. So I believe the order of presentation is going to start with Assemblymember Jones and then go to Bill Fulton, and we will conclude with Kassie Siegel. So Dave, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to spend a few moments with you this morning talking about this critically important subject. And as Richard pointed out, and as the prior panelists pointed out, a big part of our challenge in reducing greenhouse gas emissions is reducing those emissions related to the transportation and land use sector, which variously account for on the order of about 38% of the problem. But the problem is actually bigger than that. There are a number of experts who have looked at this very carefully who have concluded that even if we are able to accomplish the very laudatory goals we've set for ourselves under AB 1493, which is the fuel pipe, tailpipe emissions bill, and even if we accomplish the governor's fuel carbon standard, and even if we accomplish all of the goals we've set for ourselves under AB 32 with regard to stationary source emission reductions, the emission increases associated with California's natural growth pattern, I say natural because it's what we've been doing for the last 30 or 40 years, the emission increases associated with that will overwhelm the emission reductions we get from doing all of these other things. And that's a huge, huge problem. Why is that? Because essentially growth in California has been characterized by sprawl, by low-density development that requires people to travel greater and greater distances to and from their homes and work, and to and from their homes and any other thing. And that's simply what vehicle miles traveled is all about. It's a way of measuring the distances that people have to drive to and from their homes to get to places. And as was pointed out a moment ago, vehicle miles traveled per capita is increasing and is projected to continue to increase. And the CO2 emissions associated with that are projected to increase as well. So what do we do about that? AB 32 has, as was pointed out earlier in the day, charged the California Air Resources Board in conjunction with a number of other agencies to come up with some recommendations on what one might do in the land use and transportation sector. And CARB is busily going about the process of looking at a series of ideas and recommendations. There was a question asked earlier about whether CARB has the authority to directly regulate land use. In my reading of AB 32, I think we in the legislature have granted them that authority. I don't believe that there's a unanimity of opinion on that score, and I think also there's a political question about whether CARB will feel that it has sufficient political support to directly regulate land use. So as a consequence, there's a lot of interest in additional legislation in this area that would either further define CARB's responsibilities, give it additional authorities, or establish additional mechanisms to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with increased vehicle miles traveled and land use decision making. Now, let me give you some very telling, I think, statistics with regard to what the benefits would be of a policy built around reducing vehicle miles traveled per household in California's 4 major metropolitan areas. And then after I talk about that, I'm going to talk about some of the specific pieces of legislation that are moving. Were we to reduce by 10% vehicle miles traveled per household in the 4 major metropolitan regions in California over a 25-year period, we would attain the following benefits. We would reduce 250 tons of smog per day. That's equivalent to eliminating all smog in 2005 from electric utilities, petroleum refining, oil and gas production, and all waste disposal. We would reduce CO2 emissions by 283 million tons. 283 million tons. That's actually 4 times the CO2 reduction from smart growth in the governor's climate action plan. You would conserve 24 billion gallons of gasoline, which is equivalent to taking every car and truck off California roads for 1.5 years. You'd save at least $72 billion in fuel costs, and you would reduce the miles driven by 650 billion miles, which is equivalent to taking 2.1 million cars off the road. You'd also have tremendous other environmental benefits in terms of reducing acreage taken up in development that's open space or farmland or critical habitat. So these are all the benefits. One of the most significant, of course, is the reduction in CO2. So if we reduce VMT by 10% in 4 major metropolitan areas in 25 years, we will significantly reduce the CO2 emissions associated with the land use and transportation sector. The challenge is, how do we get there? Because there are very, very entrenched constituencies who support the status quo. The building and real estate industry is loath to have any restrictions placed on development in the state of California. Cities and counties jealously guard their authority and discretion in the land use and transportation area. So it's a very, very difficult political challenge. I believe that what we should do, if we could do it politically, is take a very aggressive approach of setting greenhouse gas reduction targets for every region and every city and every county in the state of California, and essentially require cities and counties to live within those reductions, those targets, and allow them then to plan to make land use decisions and transportation decisions accordingly. But that view is, I think, a minority view, and certainly one around which we lack sufficient political support in the legislature and dare I say it, even at the California Air Resources Board. So what is being proposed right now? There are about 4 bills currently that are moving in this area. The biggest of those bills is SB 375, which you heard about a little bit earlier, which is authored by Senator Darrell Steinberg of Sacramento, who also is the incoming President pro tem of the Senate, which is a very important fact to note, because it does mean that his bill, since it will be carried by is being carried by the future President pro tem, has a great deal of weight behind it. What does that bill do? Very simply, what it does is it has the CARB essentially allocate greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for each of the regions of California and each of the Metropolitan Transportation Planning Agencies of California, and then seeks to use those targets as a determinant of whether or not regions will get transportation dollars, or localities within those regions will get transportation dollars. That's one thing it seeks to do. The second thing it seeks to do is to use the California Environmental Quality Act as an incentive to encourage local governments to adopt plans, land use, transportation, housing plans that would conform to regional plans that reduce vehicle miles traveled per household. And the way it does that is it provides that if you have a project in a community that's adopted a general plan that itself conforms to a regional plan, that itself helps to reduce vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gases, then the amount of environmental review of your project is reduced. It's a lot more complicated than that, frankly, but that's the thrust of it. So two provisions. One is to try to link regional transportation dollars to regional plans and local plans that reduce VMT, and the other is to use CEQA as an incentive by reducing the amount of environmental review you have to do if you have a project that conforms to a general plan, that conforms to a regional plan, that itself has been environmentally studied, and that reduces vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions. So that bill is being very, very heavily opposed by a number of interests, not the least of which is the building and real estate interest, and cities and counties who view it as unfairly impinging upon their discretion and their autonomy and their authority in the land use area. The second of the 4 bills that's been introduced is my bill, AB 842, which also takes an incentive-based approach and tries to take advantage of the $42 billion in infrastructure funding that the voters of California approved 2 years ago. And what that bill simply does is, within the housing infrastructure bonds, provides that if a local government adopts a general plan and transportation plan that reduces vehicle miles traveled by 10%, then they will get extra points, a competitive advantage in applying for the housing bond money. And the idea is a simple one. It's to use the state infrastructure dollars as an incentive to get local governments to adopt local transportation and general plans that reduce vehicle miles traveled per household. It doesn't prescribe how exactly they would do that. It leaves to them the discretion to determine how to do that. How would one do that? Well, slightly higher densities, increased mixed use, investments in public transportation, design that ensures that communities are more walkable and that one can bicycle from place to place. All of these things that are out there would be available to a local government in order to reduce vehicle miles traveled per household. That bill, again, takes an incentive approach. The last two bills that have been introduced this session are also my bills, AB 2093, again, which is a fairly modest bill, but that bill simply says that as cities and counties are adopting general plan updates and new housing plans, that they would have to consider the effects of climate change in those plans and incorporate in the elements of their general plan an analysis of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and some programmatic effort to address it. Does not prescribe exactly how they're to do that analysis, does not prescribe exactly what programs they should adopt, but the goal of the bill is to begin to inject in the general planning process some recognition of the need to both analyze and adopt programmatic activity. That bill, like all the other bills, is also opposed by the cities and counties, despite its modest approach, as being too intrusive as well. The fourth bill is Assembly Bill 2596, again an incentive-based bill. What that bill says is that if CARB establishes a cap-and-trade system, and if local governments adopt plans that reduce by 25% the vehicle miles traveled in their communities, then they could take the emissions reductions associated with those plans and sell them into whatever cap-and-trade system is established. So it essentially creates a potential financial stream, a financial incentive for cities and counties to adopt plans that reduce VMT and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Sets a fairly high bar in terms of what they would have to do to accomplish that, but creates an incentive. That bill also is opposed by cities and counties as being too intrusive, notwithstanding the fact that it's just incentive-based. So I share this with you just to underscore the political challenge we face in the legislature and the interests that are supporting the status quo. And also, I guess what I would leave you with is the following. I believe that we've got a big problem, as was testified to early, and I think you've heard repeatedly from experts on this subject. And we need to start doing some dramatically different things in the land use area. And it's disappointing to me to hear local leaders talk about their commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time to send their trade associations to the state legislature to seek to defeat what are essentially fairly modest incentive-based approaches in this area. And until we get a greater recognition, I think, in the broader public of the need to make change in this area, and a greater recognition on the part of local governments that they need to be a part of this change, we're going to continue to have this kind of gridlock. And all of the other things that we seek to do under AB 1493 and AB 32 are going to be meaningful, but will not get us to the goal because we're continuing to ignore an essential part of the puzzle, which is land use and transportation. Thanks.
If it's okay with you, Rick, I think I'm going to stand up because I'm tethered to the PowerPoint, and I have to get it up there. I was not sent here by the League of Cities to defend what they're doing compared to what Dave said. In fact, I have a somewhat schizophrenic attitude toward these issues because, as Rick indicated, for a long time I've been known as this visionary regional thinker on land use, but now I'm also a typical pin-headed local official. So I kind of have to play both sides. What I want to do is I want to back up, and I agree with Dave more than I disagree. I want to back up and do a couple of basic things about land use and transportation in California, and then talk a little bit about AB 32, if I can figure out how to make this work. Which one is it? Is it? Oh, this is. There we go. I did not grow up in California. I grew up in the eastern United States, and one of the important things to understand is that sprawl, where sprawl is different in different parts of the country. This is what sprawl looks like where I grew up. This is what sprawl looks like in California. This is what density looks like where I grew up. This is what density looks like in California, okay? The point being, and the only thing that people hate worse than sprawl is density, so the worst possible thing is dense sprawl, and that's what we have here in California, and that is one of the problems. Let me go through some basic realities about this. First of all, and I didn't put this in here, but Rick reminded me of this, the level of sustained population growth in California has been unbelievable. California has been growing on average 500,000 people per year, every year, for 70 years. 500,000 people a year, every year, for 70 years. That is a level of sustained population growth unequaled in the industrialized world, and there's no reason to believe that's going to slow down. That's an enormous thing to handle. It is true, however, that California is twice as efficient, twice as land. You heard in the last panel, California is very energy efficient. We are, on a per capita basis, very efficient about most things, including the consumption of land. This is a map that shows you population. Population versus urbanization nationwide. The darker colors mean they're more dense. California, on average, we live at about 7 persons per urbanized acre. The national average is 3.5. We're going up. The nation's going down. However, the texture and pattern of urban development means the benefits of this efficiency are not easily realized because this is what it looks like. We're still tethered to the car. It's still very low rise, okay? A couple of other realities. As Rick said, VMT is growing faster than population, and that means that when you start to think about how to reduce VMT, there's a floor that you can't go below because there's a certain level of driving these people have to do, right? There's a certain level of driving these people have to do. So at some point, by raising the price of gas and regulating, all you're doing is punishing these people because they don't have any other alternative because they live in this typical California environment. So when I look at AB 32, I see all these components, and this is schematic. These pie charts, the pie sizes don't mean anything. But the important thing to look at is that we can reduce VMT without land use changes through price signals, but at some point we got to change land use in order to reduce VMT as much as we need to, as Dave said. So that leaves us to, that raises the question of where does VMT come from? And that's because we have, and the answer is we have a very fragmented system. The general path of growth is determined by transportation infrastructure, which is determined mostly at a state or regional level. I-80, wherever there's a freeway, there's going to be growth. However, the specific intensity, pattern, and texture of that growth is going to be determined by people like me, who have very narrow and parochial, and this is true of me politically, a very narrow and parochial view of what should go in my town. Okay, and I have to be very responsive to my constituents who are on top of me all the time. And then the resulting emissions are regulated by CARB out of the end of the tailpipe. So you've got the transportation agencies deciding where the general path of growth goes. You've got the local officials deciding precisely what that growth looks and feels like. And then you've got the air pollution regulators having to clean up the mess coming out of at the other end. Okay? We have a long history. AB32 to me seems like deja vu all over again, because we have a long history of unsuccessfully trying to deal with this general problem, even though we haven't had to deal with climate change. We have a 20-year history of not passing growth management legislation, unlike some other states, such as Oregon, Washington, and Florida, all of whom have done so with varying degrees of success. We also have 20 years of experience in not implementing the growth management legislation that we have passed. Dave didn't mention this, it was on his notes, I noticed, but AB 857, which was passed in 2002, requires the state, all state agencies, to, in all of their actions, to pursue 3 land use goals: infill development, compact greenfield development, and protection of agriculture and natural resources. There was a requirement that the gubernatorial administration come up with an implementation plan within a year. The Davis administration released that implementation plan 1 hour before Governor Schwarzenegger was sworn into office. We also have 20 years of unsuccessfully implementing the idea of mutual regional accountability. This is called, in land use wonky terms, this is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. The only other law in the state which follows the process that Dave just described as a possibility, which is likely to come out of SB 375, which is that the state gives the councils, the regions, a target, and then the local governments have to plan to meet the target. In implementation terms, this law has been a disaster because the local governments don't like it, and B, generally often don't even accept the legitimacy of the state government to try to impose this. We have 30 years of planning by reacting under CEQA, and we have, as Dave indicated, this endless stalemate between the enviros, the locals, and the builders over what to do. Everything on this list runs up against that legislative stalemate, which is very, very hard to break. And what we have never done is we have never connected transportation policy and land use policy in any meaningful way. Most other states don't do it either, but we don't do it, and that's important. So to me, the problem with AB 32 is AB 32 sets the bar very high. We have to reduce VMT, and if you start going around and telling average people AB 32 means they're going to have to drive less, don't you think there'd be another recall campaign? So our choices are, as Dave said, do really hard things nobody wants to do, pretend to do really hard things that won't solve the problem so that we feel good in the short run, which is the typical political solution, right? Or do things we haven't thought of before or haven't dared to try before, which is where I think we need to go. So, and, this is public policy. This is a policy seminar, right? This is all you got to work with, so you got to figure out how to do these. Now, as I've talked to CARB and people in the administration, I've found that their idea of what the solution should be has evolved since last year. Last fall, this appeared to be the solution they favored. Last winter, this appeared to be the solution they favored. Currently, this appears to be the solution they favor. And so I can only assume that by the time we get to the summer, this is going to be the solution that they favor. There aren't enough carrots in the world, is my opinion. And so I go back to say, hey, guess what? We have these things too. And not only that, but as, and Professor Henneman talked about this the last time, we have something else that we can use, which is markets. We can create markets within regulatory structures. It's not easy. It's hard to do. That is essentially what would happen under cap and trade. Dave has suggested a way to bring land use in under cap and trade. I've been thinking about that too, but I think that is inevitably part of the solution here. So there are 3 things that we know are going to happen. One is that local governments will be required, as Jerry Brown got San Bernardino County to do a GHG inventory having to do with land use and VMT. And we also know that some bill's going to pass that will give the regions the GHG targets related to VMT, as Dave said. I think that will have, whatever bill passes, it's going to have that in it. And the third thing that's going to happen is that there's going to be cap and trade and offsets in other sectors. Okay? Those are the only things that I know are going to happen. I don't know how to put all those things together to reduce VMT, but I think those are the 3 things that are going to happen. Now, we have this California Environmental Quality Act. Will it help? Will it help reduce VMT? CEQA is really good at making sure that the worst thing doesn't happen. That's what it's really, really good at. And as we found in the Jerry Brown settlement with San Bernardino County over when he sued San Bernardino County over not including greenhouse gases, CEQA's impact will be limited to feasible mitigation measures, which means there's going to be a brawl all over the place in the legislature, in the courts, over what's feasible and what's not. And I think one of the things Dave was saying is we might want to start rethinking our definition of what's feasible. And I think CEQA will help minimize GHG growth, but it won't help reduce GHGs, at least not in the land use sector, right? It's all about how do you minimize the impact. It's not about how do you reduce it. So I think we need to do 4 things, and I'm going to talk about these things very generally rather than talk in technical terms about how I think we go about this. But one is that we need to increase the capacity of the system to absorb less VMT so that the floor is lower. And what that means, that's what we mean when we talk about land use change and smart growth. That means creating neighborhoods and communities where people drive shorter distances, they have more transit and more walking. And this is something that people like me often show, how this transition might take place. I call this San Fernando Road to Paris in 4 slides. You know, this is what it looks like today, and then these dreamy architects that I work with all the time envision that the future looks like this. I think that's the last one. Yeah, and then usually somebody puts a trolley down the middle of this too. The idea being that this, whatever else you think of this, and a lot of my constituents would be terrified of this, nevertheless, this is an example of what it takes to increase the capacity of the system to absorb less VMT, to lower the floor, okay? The second thing I think we need to do is to line up all the state government's actions behind this goal. And that's AB 857, and that's something that the state admits that they don't do. So what they have to do is they have to get all their carrots and sticks pointed in the same direction, which they clearly, and also their own state government actions, the Department of General Services, and which builds office buildings and everything else. The third thing we have to do, and this is something that is happening and is happening with some effectiveness, especially in Sacramento, but also here in the Bay Area and San Diego, is line up regional agency actions behind this goal. Regional planning agencies don't really have any power, but they do have the power to, they have a lot of data and they have the power to illustrate things. And in Sacramento, the regional planning agency has adopted a blueprint, not mandatory on the local governments, but nevertheless bought into by a lot of the local governments, that shows a different way one might develop the region over the next 40 years. This is a map of, if everybody's general plan were built out, this is a map of what the Council of Governments adopted as the preferred scenario. And mapping technology allows us to do this. And if you ever see Mike McKeever, who's the head of the Regional Planning Agency, give a speech, pretty much all he does is toggle between these 2 slides. That's about half, doing this is about half the speech, okay? And you can see why. You can see why what he's saying, and this is the same number of people and the same number of jobs, okay? So you can see why he does this, because it illustrates. And then the last thing you got to do is get guys like me on Monday night and Tuesday night and Wednesday night to actually take votes on plans and development projects that actually lead to this future rather than this one, okay? And that's, I think, the hardest part. Because I don't, you know, this may look better, but if this does something that my constituents don't want, I don't want to do it, right? Because it's a tough sell. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So how do you do that? Well, I always say, as both a consultant for local governments and a local government official, I always say, when I go into a community to talk to, and I'll conclude with this about how tough this is. Whenever I go into a community and I start, as a consultant, and I start talking to them about what they should do, they always begin by saying the same 3 things, okay? The first thing they always say is, our town is unique. There is no other town on earth like ours. There is no other city by the bay that has a BART station and a UC campus, right, da-da-da-da. So the first thing I have to tell them is your town is not unique. I'm sorry. The second thing they always say, right after they say their town is unique, is they say, tell me about another town just like ours, which faced exactly the same problems we faced and solved them all. That's the second thing they always say. And so then I have to say to them, there is another other town absolutely identical to yours that has faced exactly the same problem and solved them all. The third thing they say is, you know, we just don't have enough political will. As if political will is some commodity that's out there plentifully, and there's just a market failure. They can't get at it, right? If only they could get at it. You know, it's out there. And then the last thing I have to say to them is you can't buy political will on eBay. It's organically grown, right? You can't, it's not a commodity. Well, it's probably a commodity inside the state capitol, but it's not a commodity, or at least at the fundraisers, you know, downtown Sacramento, but it's not a commodity that you can simply go out and buy on the open market. It's something you have to grow organically. And so I think the toughest thing, the way to get at people like me is to go to the people I represent and find a way to get them to understand that there's something about the future of their lives that is at stake here. And so therefore, they'd rather have Paris than San Fernando Road, even though they think they don't want that. And that is a tough, long slog that requires a great deal of grassroots political work. So that's really all I had to say. It's an honor to be here today, and thank you, Rick. What do you want?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to Rick and to Simi and to all the organizers of the conference for having me here today, and to all of you for coming out on this beautiful Friday morning to be a part of this really important discussion. I want to say a couple of words about the impact of global warming on wildlife, and then talk about how one of our existing laws, the California Environmental Quality Act, which we've heard a little bit about, can address greenhouse gas emissions. And I want to start off by telling you a little story about a place that's far away, but it's very, very important to us in California. This is the Arctic. And the Arctic is warming at about twice the rate of the rest of the world overall. It's the Earth's early warning system. And as the Arctic heats up, the sea ice is melting. This shows you summer minimum sea ice extent in September 1979, the year that the satellite record began. And this shows you sea ice extent in September 2007. We lost 1 million square miles of sea ice off the average minimum extent of the past few decades in September. And this sea ice loss is very, very important for a number of reasons. It's one of the major climate feedbacks that you're seeing graphically here. When sunlight hits snow and ice, most of the energy is reflected back into space. But when that sunlight hits open water, most of it's absorbed. So the melting of the Arctic is speeding up. And perhaps most disturbingly, the Arctic is melting far, far faster than forecast. What you're seeing here in this hopefully not too confusing slide, those dashed colored lines, those are the projections from some of the world's leading climate models of sea ice extent. And the heavy black line in the middle, that's the median projection, and the heavy red line, that's actual observed sea ice extent. And you can see that September 2007 was far below what any of the world's leading climate models project. And perhaps most disturbingly, if you follow this line over here to 2050, you can see that in 2007 there was less ice in the Arctic than more than half of the world's leading climate models projected for 2050. Things are happening faster. All of this warming, of course, is a disaster for animals that depend on the Arctic ecosystem, including the polar bear, which is completely dependent on sea ice for all of its essential behaviors, including travel and mating and hunting its primary prey of ice-dependent seals like the bearded seal. Polar bears are so ice-dependent that some mother polar bears even give birth to their cubs in snow caves like this one, which are excavated under the snow on top of the drifting ice. Polar bears can come to land, but when they're there, there's essentially nothing for them to eat. And as the sea ice breaks up earlier in the spring and retreats further off the coast each year, polar bear populations are now declining, and individual bears are drowning, they're starving, and they're even resorting to cannibalism because they don't have access to their usual food sources. This photo was taken in September 2007, and this is a female bear in northern Quebec, Canada, in the final stages of starvation. And I can't tell you that this particular bear died as a direct result of global warming because we don't know her full story, but we do know that if we don't slow the Arctic meltdown, more and more animals are going to suffer this fate. But we also know that it's not too late to do something about it and to give polar bears back their future if we have an immediate full court press on carbon dioxide and on other pollutants like methane and black carbon that have shorter atmospheric lifetimes but a very high warming impact in the Arctic. But our window of opportunity to save the polar bear is closing very rapidly now. And of course, it's not just the polar bear. It's many, many other species. A scientist by the name of Camille Parmesan and her colleagues published a paper in 2003 called The Fingerprint of Climate Change. And they looked at the impact of global warming, the warming we'd already seen, on about 1,600 species. And what they found is that 59% of those species were already experiencing impacts in one of three categories. First, that species were experiencing changes in their life history. So, for example, birds, like this ruby-crowned kinglet here, are laying their eggs earlier in the spring. Plants are blooming earlier. Also, we have changes in range, so plants and animals are shifting upwards in elevation and northwards. And finally, we have community-abundant shifts, where warm-adapted species are generally increasing and cold-adapted species are declining. The scientists found that 85% of the changes that were recorded were in the direction predicted, that they would expect to see, and that the statistical probability of this happening by chance, rather than as a result of global warming, was less than 1 in a billion. So this is the fingerprint of climate change. And as of today, we've seen an average increase in air temperature at the surface of the Earth of 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And we've seen a profound impact from this relatively small warming already. This is dwarfed by what we're going to see in the next century. And not surprisingly, given the profound impact we've already seen, the projections of future impacts to biological diversity from global warming are really grim. Under a low warming scenario, this is if we do a great job reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, scientists predict we'll lose 18%. Under a mid-range warming scenario, 24%. An extreme warming scenario, 35% of species committed to extinction by the year 2050. And it says extreme warming scenario, but unfortunately, what they used in this study is basically what we're doing now, business as usual, if we just keep doing what we're doing with emissions. So if you are a biodiversity advocate, this is really, really grim news. And it motivates you to want to do whatever you can do about it. And it also brings home the message that we're choosing our future now. The decisions we make today about emissions will determine what kind of world we live in the future. This slide just shows a range of impacts that will be experienced in California, which is particularly vulnerable to climate change. You can see business as usual will lose 90% of the Sierra snowpack, perhaps, but if we do a good job reducing emissions, maybe we'll retain up to 70% of that. Wildfire risk is very important. Wildfire risk is going to continue to increase, but if we reduce emissions, it increases much less. The decisions we make now matter so much, and that brings me to the California Environmental Quality Act. How many people here have a general working familiarity with CEQA? Okay, excellent. Wow, almost everybody. So, as you know, CEQA says that state and local agencies have to examine all of the environmental impacts of their discretionary actions. They need to analyze mitigation measures, alternatives, and avoidance measures to reduce those impacts for all significant effects. And they need to adopt those measures if they're found to be feasible. So it seemed to us for quite a while now that, of course, agencies should be looking at greenhouse gas emissions under CEQA, and we asked them to do 5 things. And we said, please provide a scientific background of climate change. Please give us an inventory of your project's emissions. Discuss the impact of global warming on the project and the project's impacts. Make a significance determination, and then adopt measures to reduce the emissions. And we started with the easy stuff and with the good news, because there's so much good news out there about building, for example. So we said, please look at the orientation of the houses you're going to build and the overhangs, and look at passive solar construction. Build your house so that you have the windows in the shade in the summertime and in the sun in the wintertime to take advantage of passive heating and cooling. We think this is a feasible mitigation measure because it doesn't add anything to the cost of your project. And look at solar water heating. These things are so good now, so cost effective in California. And of course, look at PV. After you've done everything to reduce the energy use of the house in the first place, look at generating that energy from renewable sources. We can do so much. We can build carbon neutral buildings in California today. The technology was there. We can actually build buildings which are all mini power plants today. Very good news. And the response we got from agencies universally across the board was, no, we're not going to do that. And they said, we're not going to do that for various reasons. Some said that greenhouse gas emissions are beyond the scope of CEQA. And then AB32 passed, and a reason given to us was, we're not going to do that because AB32 takes care of that, and therefore we don't have to do it under CEQA. And fortunately, the California legislature said very, very clearly, several times actually in the law, but up here, that AB32 doesn't excuse compliance with any provision of existing law. How many people here have read the opinion in Massachusetts versus EPA? Great. So remember the part in there where Justice Stevens says that global warming is not the kind of problem that agencies and legislatures solve in one fell swoop, that you have to whittle away at it over time. I think this is such an important point. We have to use all of the tools we have. We have to analyze solutions in all possible contexts. And it's absolutely true, CEQA deals with new growth. And we need, of course, other laws. And we're so lucky to be living in California, which is the laboratory of new policy. But we have to enforce rigorously existing laws that already address the problem. So when agencies told us they weren't going to do it, we did what we attended this law school to learn how to do, and we started suing. And we brought our first case in November 2006, and then we brought several others throughout 2007. But perhaps most importantly, the California Attorney General also, as you've heard, brought suit against San Bernardino County, as there were two separate cases filed, the Attorney General's and the environmental plaintiffs. And that case was ultimately settled, and the County of San Bernardino agreed to go back and add to their general plan a new section which would do a greenhouse gas inventory for 1990, the present, and then for the future. They'd measure emissions, and then they would put in place a goal to reduce emissions over the next 30 years of growth, and then they would analyze measures to actually do that. They have a couple years to do it, but San Bernardino County, the largest county in the state, in fact, the largest county in the country, and not a place with stringent land use regulations. I know because I live in San Bernardino County, and when I leave my residential neighborhood and I go for a walk in the desert every evening, I have to be careful not to get run over by the kids on their ATVs or shot by the folks who are doing target practice in the desert near where I live. It's not a highly regulated county. So if we can do it in San Bernardino County, we can do it everywhere. And through the last year or so, things started to change. In 2006, only 2 CEQA documents looked at greenhouse gas emissions. There were 149 in 2007. January 2008, we have 25. That puts us on a track to have 300 this year, and I actually think that this is going to keep increasing and that will actually blow this away. The power of the argument that you have to look at greenhouse gas emissions under CEQA did not go unnoticed. We submitted at least 50 comment letters over the past year, I'd say. There's 3 major oil refinery expansions proposed in the Bay Area that we were commenting on. The California Attorney General has also been involved in, and a number of very, very powerful and important industries, including the Western States Petroleum Association and the Building Industry Association and a lot of others, went to the legislature starting in spring and summer 2007 and said, you know what, we have a really big problem here. And we think that these CEQA suits are actually a premature attempt to enforce AB32, and the legislature should really do something about this. Now, I've never understood why they chose to frame the issue that way, because as a lawyer, I think that's clearly wrong. I mean, I think CEQA enforcement is clearly separate from AB32 enforcement, and it's not an argument that's correct. It's not really an argument that made sense, but for whatever reason, that's the way it was framed. And the Senate Minority Caucus took up the cause. And when California's budget was before the legislature last year, in California it takes a 2/3 vote of the legislature to pass the budget. What that meant last year in the Senate was that 2 Republican votes were needed to pass the budget. And do folks remember how it was hung up for over a month last year? So there was a list of demands that the caucus wanted met, but at the top of that list was a CEQA exemption, and this is what they said. The California Attorney General has threatened to file lawsuits and in some cases actually sued counties' infrastructure projects and new housing projects under CEQA for failing to mitigate greenhouse gas pollution. These suits have been filed despite the fact that the regulations has not even adopted. How can California cities and counties and businesses obey unwritten regulations? We didn't really understand that because we felt it was very clear under CEQA what they had to do and separate from AB 32. But this is the way it went in, and what ultimately emerged from this process when the budget was passed over 30 days after the deadline was a law called SB 97. And SB 97 ultimately, after all those deliberations or whatever happened there in Sacramento was finished, was a very, very good law. It's a net benefit to our efforts to address greenhouse gas emissions under CEQA because it clarified the very obvious to me, but not to other people, need for agencies and project proponents to look at greenhouse gas emissions in CEQA review. And it said, you know, we do have a problem. It's not clear this is new. They need some guidance. And OPR and the Resources Agency should promulgate guidance on the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions under CEQA. And they have until January 1, 2010 to do that. There was also a part 2 of SB 97, which addressed the other problem as it was stated, and it said that for certain classes of projects, and you have to meet 2 criteria. You have to be a project that's subject to regulations adopted under AB 32, and you have to be a project that is funded by one of these 2 bond projects. If those 2 criteria are met, then there's a type of exemption, and the law says your project can't be subject to a suit under CEQA for failing to look at greenhouse gas emissions. However, this provision of the law sunsets on January 1, 2010. And it's very unlikely that any regulations will be adopted under AB 32 prior to this date. There's no reason why they couldn't be. There's nothing that says they can't be adopted sooner, but most of the regulations probably aren't going to be enforced until after 2012. So it's very unlikely that the exemption provision will ever apply to anything, but nevertheless, it's in there to address the concerns. But we're now moving forward under SB 97. So I call the phase we're moving into now under CEQA phase 2. We had a big fight and a number of lawsuits filed just over this issue of, do we have to do it? I think it's really, really clear now that we have to do it. And now we're going into phase 2, and there's a lot of reasons being raised about why we don't get a lot of good mitigation under CEQA, and agencies are saying, for example, that they can't make a significance determination because there's no thresholds of significance adopted for greenhouse gas emissions, making a lot of other arguments, some of which will probably be hashed out in the court. But there's 3 very important things going on. Number 1, OPR and the Resources Agency are adopting these guidelines for mitigation that have to be in place by January 1, 2010. That's very important. The South Coast Air Quality Management District has just convened a working group to set thresholds of significance for greenhouse gas emissions. We hope and expect that other air districts will do the same. We think that these should be adopted in conjunction with a mitigation fee and program so that after you've done everything you can do to reduce emissions in the first place, you have the possibility of offsetting those emissions and bringing the emissions from your project down to 0. One of the big concerns that's been expressed is that if If any greenhouse gas emissions are cumulatively significant, which we believe they are, then you could never do a neg deck for a project because you would always have significant impact under CEQA. But we think this isn't the case if you have a threshold of significance which is low and then a mitigation fee program that you can offset in. And finally, our organization is turning our attention very strongly to general plans and transportation plans, other types of projects where we can get the most bang for our buck in terms of planning, and giving agencies now very, very specific recommendations about what they can do in their general plans to address growth and to really reduce those emissions from all the new growth. Our lead CEQA attorney, Matthew Vespa, is here in the audience in the back there. So if folks want to discuss this more, I unfortunately have another commitment and I'm going to run after this panel, but please grab Matt or please ask any questions during the discussion on any of these topics more in depth. Thanks very, very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, in a moment, we're going to engage you more directly into the conversation, so I hope a number of you have questions and we'll present them to the panel. So while people are hopefully starting to queue up for that opportunity, let me ask just a couple of follow-up questions of our panelists. And the first one, I guess I'm going to try and put the Assemblymember Jones on the spot here, but with respect to the piece of pending legislation that is probably the most greatly publicized piece of environmental legislation in the current legislative session, SB 375, which you have mentioned. Could you talk a little bit about the prognosis for that bill? It's, as you mentioned, it's being carried by State Senator Steinberg, who is the State Senate President pro tem-elect. I know he feels strongly about this bill, but as you mentioned, there are a lot of folks who have a lot of skepticism about the bill, either in concept or in detail. So I'd be interested in your prognosis, and of course, I'm sure Bill and Kassie and their organizations are following it as well, and I welcome your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Well, it's now what we call a two-year bill. It was introduced last year, and given the amount of opposition to the bill's progress was slowed considerably. It was actually held in the Assembly Appropriations Committee last year. And so I think the outcome is still in doubt. It's actually a fairly modest bill in terms of what it does. I mean, all of the bills that I've described are pretty modest. It's rather lengthy because the way in which it does what it does requires a lot of changes to the code, but at the end of the day, it's fundamentally an incentive-based approach, like all of the bills, and I think it's unfortunate that there isn't the same sense of urgency around the land use issue that there was at the time that we adopted AB 32, and some of that I think is a function of the fact that there are many in the legislature and outside who feel that we did this great thing when we adopted AB 32, and now the California Resources Board is going to figure it out. Let's let them do that, and we can focus our attention on other things. But as was pointed to early, we're in a crisis, and we don't have time to dither, and we are making decisions now in the land use context that we're going to be living with for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so if we don't start doing some aggressive things, we're not going to get to the goals that we've set for ourselves. I want to ask for a copy of the skinny polar bear slide because I'm thinking of blowing it up and taking it with me to the next hearing that I have on some of the bills. I think at the end of the day, though, Darrell will probably get the bill through, and I think because of his position in the legislature, he's in a good position to do that. But I think that bill will undergo significant amendments. It will be weakened probably to get it through. And we need the help of Californians to rise up essentially and say, look, these are modest things and we need to get them done.
Bill? Kassie?
I don't have anything to add to that at this point.
All right, why don't we start? Professor Carlson.
So I have a question. First, thanks. Those were just absolutely terrific presentations and very interesting. Plus, you're all wonderful speakers. I'm just wondering whether the focus on vehicle miles traveled is the right focus. And the reason I say that is because I currently live in a city that's actually doing a lot of what Bill Fulton suggested be done. That is the city of Los Angeles, which is remarkably dense, despite the popular view of Los Angeles as sprawling everywhere. And the result is that we probably drive fewer miles, but we also sit in traffic for long periods of time. And I assume that our driving patterns actually are, emit a lot of carbon because we're stopping and starting as opposed to driving at 35 or 45 or 55 miles an hour. So I'm wondering whether the focus really ought to be on reducing carbon emissions even further among on passenger automobiles, trucks, and so forth, as opposed to reducing vehicle miles traveled. That's not to say that there aren't ancillary benefits or important benefits to be achieved by the kind of land use approaches that you're discussing, but I'm curious whether the empirical evidence is actually accurate that reducing vehicle miles traveled through increased density is going to get us the payoff in reduced carbon emissions that we're actually looking for.
Well, I'm not a scientist, so I'm hesitant to say unequivocally, yes, it will. I think it's affected by those operational issues you described, but generally speaking, lower VMT means lower emissions, and I would go back to what Dave said at the beginning, which is that the whole point of this, and the reason land use is in the middle of this, is that even if we do everything else absolutely right, it's still not enough. So we have to do this too.
I would also just say that it's definitely not just VMT. It's the three-legged stool. So you have VMT, and then you have fuel economy, and then you have the carbon content of the fuel. I think if you're getting at things like timing of traffic lights and more efficient movement of traffic, yes, that's all good. If you're getting at increasing capacity in order to speed up the traffic, no, because we can't keep increasing capacity in California for vehicles, because you increase capacity and then the roads just fill up again, and then you have the same problem, only bigger, and study after study has shown that. And I mean, I think that we need to have less single passenger car driving, but there's also technologically available solutions today, such as electric cars that you plug into PV panels on your house, that we have to be transitioning to more quickly as well.
I think you need to do all three, and I think the reason why I've been focusing on VMT is that the other two we have adopted policies or legislation to address. On this one, we have fallen far, far short of the mark. The other thing about VMT is I mean, it begins to sound a little bit like a fetish or an obsession, but the reason for the focus on VMT is it is one of the few things that you can quantify in the land use and transportation context, where you can actually model based on alternative land use and transportation scenarios what is going to happen to VMT and what's going to happen as a result of CO2 emissions. And that makes it a tremendously powerful metric, both in terms of measuring what's going on, but also in terms of accountability. I mean, we've had, as Bill pointed out, statutes and policies on the books that call for smart growth in a variety of different ways, but ultimately they've been unenforceable because folks can adopt plans that say we're doing these things and do some of these things, but there's no really rigorous way to measure whether in fact they're doing these things in the way that you can measure, I think, VMT. So that's the other reason why, from a policy perspective, I think there's so much focus on it, because it's measurable, it's a metric, you can model it, and in fact, as Bill pointed out earlier, a number of the major regions in California are adopting regional plans that do exactly that. The trick now is to get the local plans to conform to those regional plans, and that's where things fall down, because local decision makers, as Bill pointed out, are motivated and incentivized by the parochial issues in their communities. And so that's why I think one of the ways to try to change that behavior is to use money as an incentive. And so we've got $42 billion in infrastructure funding that the state has. When I was on a city council, we wanted state dollars. I mean, it was like the fourth thing that they would say to you when you came in the room. Bill said 3. The fourth thing was, and where's the money to pay for this stuff? And so we are really missing an opportunity if we don't take a sizable portion of that $42 billion and link it directly to whether or not local governments adopt local general plans that tie into these regional plans to reduce VMT. And unfortunately, though, again, many of these same local governments in their minds and builders and others have already spent that $42 billion 5 times over, and they're very, very resistant to tinkering with the criteria. But unless we do that, we're missing a tremendous opportunity.
Sir.
I was just curious whether there's any role for Caltrans in this whole thing. It's one agency I haven't heard mentioned. And also, the state, I think, is the largest builder of buildings in the state. And I think the University of California is second largest. And I wonder if land use planning is any policies about how and where those buildings are built.
That's why I mentioned the state law, AB 857, which theoretically applies, I think the wording is, to all agencies, entities, and instruments of the state. Caltrans is mostly a construction company. And the actual decisions about whether and where and how to build highways in particular are made essentially by the regional planning agencies. So Caltrans, there's very, very important issues associated with how Caltrans constructs things, but it's not quite as important in the planning side as you might think. And I agree with you that the state the state agencies certainly are not coordinated with each other, and generally speaking, are nowhere on this. I was listening to Christopher Cabaldon, the mayor of West Sacramento, who was running for the Assembly, talk the other day about, on the one hand, he's thrilled that the Department of General Services, which builds office buildings, is building an office building on the riverbank in West Sacramento. However, they've apparently, but he dislikes the fact that he says they operate it like it's a prison, and so therefore you can't generate anything around it going. And the same thing with STRS is also building a building in West Sacramento, he said, and unfortunately they have a trading floor, which means they have they have other regulations they have to deal with. So I think speaking as a local official, the state would be a much more credible player coming to the table telling me what to do if the state was following its own law about how to do this, which it's not.
Air quality management plans incorporate VMT by way of the regional traffic models, and regions that are non-attainment for federal ozone standards also are subject to general conformity and federal transportation conformity. My question is to the Assemblyman. You talked about COGS establishing GHG thresholds and then those being applied to general plans and other cities and counties within their jurisdiction. My question is, what kind of accountability would that approach give to this effort as long as local entities, despite an ambitious plan subject to your idea, as long as they're able to approve projects with statements of overriding consideration, we just have a shift of the burden elsewhere. And I see that in criteria pollutants in my air region all the time, where certain jurisdictions are so fond of affordable housing that they never mitigate their excess emissions. So how do we approach equity in a regional way to avoid shifting burdens to people who just politically do not have the will to help us along?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, in my ideal world, what you'd do is you'd set greenhouse gas emission targets or requirements at the regional level and then drill down to the local level and distribute those as well, and not do so in a political way. That is to say, where, you know, if you have enough votes on the COG board, you can avoid, you know, taking your share and you outvote the other folks, and then but actually do the distribution, you know, based on essentially some projections with regard to, you know, the relative growth that's going to occur in each and every one of those communities. That's what I would do ideally. And then I would say you can't approve development that takes you in a particular community outside of that envelope. Okay, that's what I would do. There is no political consensus to support that right now, and there's a tremendous entrenched series of interests in opposition to that. So that shifts us to, you know, the carrots, unfortunately. And then what the carrots are all about, again, is trying to find ways to encourage local governments to conform their plans to regional plans that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and VMT. And, you know, my approach is infrastructure dollars. Darrell's approach is regional transportation dollars and a relaxation of CCELP requirements. I've got another bill I mentioned which would allow you to trade into a cap-and-trade system, so there's a financial incentive there. You know, Bill's done a brilliant white paper on establishing a land use cap-and-trade system within land use. That could create an economic incentive. But those are the sorts of things that I think are more politically viable. But even those things face enormous challenges because we have these entrenched interests that don't want to see any change in this area.
Henry.
Hi. So I guess the theme of this panel is about integrating land use and transportation planning, and that seems like a very complex challenge. And one thing that when I look at SB 375 that's concerning is that it still doesn't really put it all together and get VMTs in line with, say, CARB's mandate under AB 32. So there's no real measurement under that bill for measuring greenhouse gases, inventorying the kind of progress and kind of establishing maybe a carrot system based on that progress. So I guess my two questions are, CARB currently is going to be considering their scoping plan a local government protocol system for looking at greenhouse gases and trying to come up with a way to inventory them. And I'm wondering how challenging that would be as someone in city government to kind of try to quantify your progress in line with AB 32, so that somehow count towards that. And I guess the second question is for mostly the lawyers up there, as the question of preemption. On a more technical level, I guess, what you guys see the possibility of CARB actually being able to preempt a local land use authority for saying, you know, you have to, if you've set a target and they don't meet it, what happens then?
Why don't we start with the first question?
Since I'm the only person up here who's not a lawyer, let me answer the first part of the question and then shut up. How's that? I think your question about creating protocols or standard operating procedure for measuring the greenhouse gas emissions at the local level is a really good one. And I think we're all going to go to school on what San Bernardino County will do. As Kassie said, not the most obvious place to start, which is probably the reason Jerry started there, knowing him, right? But I think there, what the San Bernardino County settlement says, if I remember it right, is that they've got to inventory everything associated with land use and then everything associated with county operations. I think that's right. I think I would favor trying to do this as an integrated way as possible because, as Kassie pointed out, there's also a lot you can do in the buildings themselves, and you can probably create somehow financial incentives for people to even retrofit existing buildings. And so in some cases, you might actually trade off something in the land use arena at the local level for some building thing or so forth. So I think that an integrated approach is probably a good idea, but we're not even to the point of thinking about that yet. I would also say, however, that in my view as a land use planner, a carbon neutral building doesn't do you much good if you have to drive to it.
Dave, as a former local government official, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, let me answer what I think was the second part of the question, which is, does CARB have the legal authority and how would it enforce regulation? I think I said earlier, I believe it does have the legal authority, but I think the political will, to use the phrase that Bill used earlier, is not there for it to do that. And there's not a consensus of agreement about it having the authority under AB 32. But AB 32, vests CARB the authority to essentially regulate all sectors, and I think land use is a sector. So what we're going to see instead, I think, is some series of CARB efforts to require local governments to establish inventories, to begin planning, maybe to set some targets regionally, but you're going to also see legislation moving that seeks to take things even further. But again, largely will be incentive-based, just because it's very difficult to get a bill out and onto the governor's desk and signed that takes a mandatory approach.
Let me just interject. I agree with that last conclusion in terms of the likelihood, or more properly, the unlikelihood of any kind of preemption effort. One of the additional disconnects beyond which we've been talking about is that in terms of the regulatory approach to greenhouse gases, just as it is with respect to conventional pollutants, that's been driven by federal and more recently state regulatory authority for some time. Conversely, in California, as in most jurisdictions around the nation, land use has been the prerogative and the province of local governments. And whereas the ARB has been quite aggressive and quite much in a leadership role with respect to fuel content and efficiency standards for vehicular sources and on, I think this is an area, the area of land use is one where the ARB, recognizing as it does that it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to meet AB 32 targets without the kind of very imaginative approaches to land use and transportation policy, I think, just as Dave mentioned, is going to be very disinclined to inject itself too explicitly, too directly in that land use regulatory process through the aggressive assertion of any preemption power it might have. We are actually at a close for this panel, and since we're already running a little bit over, why don't we use this opportunity to thank our panel for what I thought was a very enlightening conversation. Thank you.